Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a topic that quite literally reshaped the modern world as we know it, World War I. But look, instead of just memorizing a bunch of dry dates and battle maps, we are going to dig into the visceral, human stories behind the history. We're going to explore how this terrifying industrial meat grinder fundamentally changed the lives of millions of people forever, and how it set the stage for the reality we navigate right now.
Okay, let's dive right into this. 65 million. I want you to really think about that number for a second. That is the mind-boggling number of men mobilized globally to fight in this conflict. Just imagine the sheer scale of that. You had young men from farms, factories, and cities across the globe packing into trains with flowers in their hands and this highly romanticized vision of war in their heads. They were cheerfully marching toward a conflict they couldn't possibly comprehend.
But as we know, that romance died very, very quickly. Because out of those millions of mobilized men, an unimaginable 17 million became casualties. It's just staggering. This number instantly establishes the horrific and completely unprecedented human cost of the war. I mean, it wasn't just a military struggle, it was an absolute human catastrophe. Which really makes you wonder, how did it escalate to this level so fast?
Well, it all traces back to a fatal domino effect. In June 1914, a 19-year-old nationalist named Gavrila Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. And because Europe was basically sitting on a powder keg of fragile, secret alliances, that single spark just ignited everything. Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia, then Russia steps in to defend Serbia, Germany jumps in to back Austria, declares war on Russia, and then launches an invasion of France right through neutral Belgium. By August 4th, Great Britain had declared war on Germany. So within mere weeks, the entire continent was locked into an unstoppable chain reaction.
And that brings us to the core tragedy of the early war. You've basically got this deadly mismatch between 19th century tactics and 20th century technology. The generals were still thinking about marching in straight lines, ordering cavalry charges, wearing bright uniforms, and holding on to this cheerful belief that everyone would be home by Christmas. But they ran headfirst into an industrialized nightmare. We're talking about massive artillery that could vaporize concrete forts, submarines lurking in the depths, and devastating machine guns capable of firing up to 600 rounds a minute. Soldiers charging across open fields were simply mowed down like grass.
Because neither side could break through these crazy new defensive weapons, the conflict quickly devolved into a war of attrition. You see, this wasn't about clever tactical victories anymore. It became a brutal math equation. The goal was simply to outbleed the enemy. Take the Battle of Verdun, for example. The German commander literally planned to bleed France white. It resulted in nearly 300 days of relentless slaughter, where hundreds of thousands died for absolutely zero territorial gain.
To try and break that terrifying deadlock, nations turned to some incredibly dark new technologies that expanded the battlefield into the oceans and the skies. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, sinking commercial ships without warning. Most infamously, the passenger liner Lusitania, which, by the way, eventually helped drag a furious United States into the war. Up in the sky, massive German Zeppelins, literally the size of 2 football fields, brought the terror of aerial bombing directly to civilian cities like London, forcing the first ever citywide blackouts. And over on land, the British introduced armored tanks at the Somme to finally try and crush their way through the trench lines.
But honestly, for the average soldier, the real terror wasn't just the enemy's weapons. It was the ground-level horror of simply living in the trenches. Standing in stagnant, freezing water led to trench foot, where limbs would quite literally rot, requiring brutal amputations. To try and prevent it, soldiers would rub gallons of whale oil on their feet. Then you had the rats. Fed on unburied corpses, these rodents grew to the size of cats, and lice were absolutely everywhere, spreading debilitating trench fever. Soldiers would actually spend their rare downtime in what they called chatting sessions, using candle flames to pop and burn the lice out of their uniforms. Nature and disease were fighting them just as hard as the actual enemy.
Then, humanity crossed another really dark line. Picture this, it's 1915, and soldiers see this heavy, yellow-green cloud drifting across no man's land. It wasn't a smokescreen, it was chlorine gas. When chlorine mixes with the moisture in human lungs, it turns to acid, literally drowning soldiers from the inside out. Now, there were no official gas masks yet, so the only way to survive was this desperate, visceral hack discovered by a quick-thinking Canadian doctor. You had to urinate on a handkerchief or a sock and tie it tightly over your mouth.
The ammonia in the urine neutralized the chlorine chemical reaction. That crude trick saved the lives of those who could act fast enough.
When you hear about these kinds of conditions, it is absolutely vital to pause and remember the deep psychological toll it took. There's this harrowing quote from an Indian soldier stationed in the freezing mud of the Western Front. He wrote, "This is not war. This is the end of the world." It's so important for us to remember the real humanity behind these grim statistics. These were ordinary men thrust into an apocalyptic nightmare that resembled literally nothing they had ever known.
Yet right in the middle of this apocalyptic horror, there was this breathtaking flash of humanity. During the first winter, in 1914, an impromptu Christmas truce broke out. German and British soldiers actually stopped firing, climbed out of their trenches, and met in no man's land. They sang Silent Night, traded rations like sausages and tobacco, and even played a makeshift game of football right there in the bomb craters. It showed that these ordinary men simply wanted peace. But of course, this brotherly truce deeply angered the commanding officers. It also completely infuriated a young 25-year-old German corporal named Adolf Hitler, who felt it was a total disgrace to their nation.
Now, what's also incredibly crucial to remember is that this was a truly global conflict. We so often picture European soldiers fighting this war, but look at the massive contribution from around the world. For instance, 1.3 million Indian soldiers and laborers were shipped across the globe to fight for the British Empire. They were bleeding in the freezing trenches of France and out in the deserts of the Middle East. Men like Khudadad Khan, who famously held the line single-handedly with a machine gun, they really proved that the heavy burden of this war was carried by the entire world.
And that burden definitely wasn't just on the soldiers. This was the era of total war, meaning the home front became just as vital as the battlefield itself. Millions of women entered the workforce to replace the men who were away fighting. In British munitions factories, women were handling highly toxic TNT all day to build bombs and artillery shells. The chemical exposure was so intense that it literally turned their skin yellow and their hair green. People called them the Canary Girls. Many of them suffered severe liver disease and died. They were fighting, sacrificing, and giving their lives for the war effort too.
And speaking of total war, this conflict raged way beyond the Western Front. Down in the dense jungles of Africa, German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged a relentless 4-year guerrilla war against much larger Allied forces, and he actually remained undefeated until the war's end. Over in Asia, Japan leveraged the chaos to seize a German naval base at Qingdao in China. Incredibly, they utilized the world's very first seaplane carrier to launch aerial attacks. Meanwhile, over in the Middle East, the British backed the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, famously aided by T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia.
Fast forward to 1917, and the European powers are just completely, utterly exhausted. The war finally reaches this dramatic turning point. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare ultimately provoked the United States into declaring war in April, pouring fresh millions of men into the Allied lines. At the same time, a devastated Russia collapsed internally. The Bolshevik Revolution forced them to sign a peace treaty and exit the war entirely. So Germany knew they had this tiny, narrow window before the Americans arrived in full force. They launched one final desperate spring offensive in 1918, but it burned out. Facing exhaustion and mutinies back home, Germany really had no choice. On November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The guns finally went silent.
But here is the really crucial point. When the fighting ended, true peace was absolutely far from achieved. The leaders met in Paris to draft the Treaty of Versailles, and it was an incredibly bitter settlement. Germany got hit with massive financial reparations, severe territorial losses, and a super humiliating war guilt clause that forced them to accept full responsibility for the entire conflict. Instead of building a stable foundation for lasting world peace, the incredibly harsh terms of this treaty just bred deep, festering resentment across a ruined nation. To top it off, the old world order was just completely erased. We're talking about a massive political earthquake here, where 4 enormous empires simply ceased to exist. The Russian Empire collapsed into revolution, giving birth to the Soviet Union. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was totally dismantled into new independent states. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and its Middle Eastern territories were carved up into European-controlled mandates. And the German Empire? It was transformed into the super-fragile Weimar Republic and completely stripped of its overseas colonies. The global map was fundamentally, violently redrawn.
Which leaves us with a pretty haunting realization. They famously called this the war to end all wars. But looking at the shattered global economies, the millions of traumatized veterans returning home to zero jobs, and that bitter, punitive peace established in 1918, we really have to ask ourselves, did this conflict end anything?
Or did all that unresolved anger and those hastily redrawn borders directly pave the way for an even darker chapter just a couple decades later in World War II? It's definitely a heavy thought to leave you with, but understanding the past is really the only way we can truly navigate the future. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.